Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we dive into powerful tales that touch the heart and ignite the spirit. Today, we bring you the inspiring journey of Colonel Marcus Reed, a soldier whose unwavering determination and deep loyalty carried him through unimaginable challenges to honor a fallen friend. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a harsh glare on the bustling airport as Colonel Marcus Reed stepped out of the taxi. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete, a sharp counterpoint to the dull cacophony of engines, suitcases, and hurried voices around him. The weight on his shoulders was more than just the decorated medals pinned to his chest. It was the solemn mission he had undertaken. In his hand, he carried the carefully prepared documents to transport the remains of Private First Class Thomas Keller, his closest friend and brother-in-arms. Thomas Keller wasn't just another soldier to Marcus. He had been a confidant, a partner in survival, and the kind of man who saw beyond ranks, skin color, or background. On the battlefield, their bond had been forged through shared victories and losses, laughter during fleeting moments of calm, and the unshakable trust that only soldiers can understand. When Keller fell in an ambush overseas, Marcus had sworn a promise to bring him home. It was a vow rooted in love, respect, and an understanding of what Keller's family would need to heal. The mission was more than an obligation. It was Marcus's tribute to the man who had stood by his side when others faltered. Marcus adjusted his military dress uniform, his movements deliberate and composed, though his heart carried the weight of loss. As he stepped into the terminal, the contrast between his purpose and the everyday hustle around him struck hard. People scurried past, focused on their own destinations, oblivious to the significance of his journey. A few noticed his uniform and glanced in curiosity or fleeting respect, but most didn't pause. Marcus didn't mind. His mission wasn't about recognition. It was about fulfilling a sacred duty. The atmosphere shifted when he reached the check-in counter. A young attendant greeted him with a polite but detached smile. "Ticket and ID." "Please," she said, her tone businesslike. Marcus handed over his documents, explaining the special nature of his trip. "I'm escorting a military casket," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to surface. The name Private First Class Thomas Keller felt heavy on his tongue, like a weight he couldn't set down. The attendant scanned his documents, her expression hardening into one of subtle skepticism. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, guarded and questioning. "You're the officer in charge?" she asked, as though doubting the uniform, the medals, or the man before her. Marcus nodded calmly. "Yes, I am." Her demeanor shifted further as she turned to whisper to her colleague, their hushed tones carrying a faint edge of suspicion. Marcus recognized it instantly. It was the familiar questioning of his legitimacy, his authority, his worth. He'd faced it countless times before, but it still stung. Standing tall, he clasped his hands behind his back, silently willing himself to patience. He thought of Keller's family waiting for their son's return, their grief raw and exposed. He wasn't just carrying Keller's body. He was carrying their hope, their closure. Minutes stretched into eternity as Marcus waited for the whispers to end and the process to continue. His gaze remained steady, but his mind was racing. He thought of Keller's wife, her tearful gratitude for the promise Marcus had made. He thought of the small, quiet town where Keller would be laid to rest, surrounded by people who loved him. And he thought of the mission that had brought them together in the first place, the bond that transcended race, rank, and background. Marcus's focus never wavered. He was here to keep a promise. No amount of suspicion or indignity would deter him. This was for Thomas Keller, the man who had stood by his side, who had seen his worth when others couldn't. Together, they had faced battles on distant shores. Now, Marcus was ready to face one more to bring his brother home. The minutes dragged on as Marcus waited at the counter. His polished stance and composed demeanor belied the frustration simmering inside. The attendant returned with a manager, a middle-aged man with a stiff posture and a gaze that lingered on Marcus just a moment too long. The man's presence only added to the air of suspicion hanging around the situation. "Colonel Reed, is it?" the manager asked, glancing at Marcus's documents as though searching for an error. Yes, that's correct, Marcus replied, his voice steady. He had long since mastered the art of remaining calm under scrutiny. But moments like these reminded him of battles fought outside the battlefield, ones rooted in prejudice and quiet disrespect. We just need to verify some details, the manager said, his tone almost dismissive. Standard procedure. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't standard. He had seen how others in uniform, particularly those who didn't look like him, were treated with immediate respect and ease. But here he stood, his rank, medals, and mission scrutinized as though he were an imposter. Everything is in order, Marcus said firmly. The paperwork has been cleared by military authorities. This transport has been arranged in advance. The manager gave a tight-lipped nod, but signaled to a nearby security guard. Marcus's stomach clenched as two officers approached, their body language stiff and unwelcoming. He could feel the weight of passengers' stares, the way their curiosity hung in the air like an invisible cloud. To them, he was just another figure in a uniform, someone they neither understood nor cared to know. Colonel Reed, we're going to need to conduct a secondary screening, one officer said, his tone devoid of respect. Please come with us. Marcus hesitated for a moment, the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He could protest, demand to speak to a higher authority, but he knew it would accomplish nothing. Resistance would only give them ammunition to escalate the situation. So he nodded, his voice calm but firm. Fine, let's get this over with. The officers led him away from the bustling terminal to a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural glow on the metal table at its center. Place your belongings on the table, one of them instructed. Marcus unclipped his medals with steady hands, placing them beside his carefully folded documents and the small flag he carried for Keller. Each item felt like a piece of himself being laid bare for judgment. They searched him thoroughly, their hands cold and impersonal. They inspected his medals, rifled through his papers, and even examined Keller's dog tag, as though it might be counterfeit. Marcus's heart ached as they handled the tag with indifferent fingers, its engravings a silent testament to the man he was trying to honor. You're clear, one officer said finally, his tone curt. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the unnecessary humiliation they had inflicted. Marcus reattached his medals with deliberate precision, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the effort to suppress his anger. He refused to let them see how deeply they had cut. As he stepped back into the terminal, the bright, bustling space felt suffocating. The knot in his chest grew tighter as he saw the departure board. His flight had been delayed. Another hurdle, another test of his patience. But Marcus wasn't one to falter. This mission wasn't just about delivering Keller's remains. It was about honor, about loyalty, and about a promise that transcended every obstacle in his path. He found a seat near the gate, his posture straight despite the exhaustion pulling at him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Keller's dog tag, running his thumb over the name engraved on its surface. Keller's voice echoed in his mind, clear as the day they'd spoken their last words. Get me home, Marcus. If anything happens, promise me you'll get me home. I will, Marcus whispered under his breath, his gaze locked on the flashing red letters of the departure board. Delayed. Again, he clenched the dog tag in his hand, willing himself to patience. No amount of bureaucracy, prejudice, or indifference would stop him. The waiting area around him buzzed with restless energy. Passengers complained about delayed flights, oblivious to the weight of Marcus's journey. For them, it was an inconvenience. For Marcus, it was a battle, one he was determined to win. He straightened his hat and sat taller, preparing himself for whatever lay ahead. He would keep his promise to Keller, no matter what it took. This was more than duty. It was love, loyalty, and a testament to the bond they had shared. Marcus wouldn't let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. As Marcus sat at the gate, trying to steady himself amidst the swirl of emotions, he noticed the growing buzz around him, It wasn't just the usual grumbling of delayed passengers or the mundane hum of airport life. There was a different energy in the air. "Is that him?" someone whispered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, the colonel they dragged into security earlier. I saw the whole thing." Marcus shifted in his seat, glancing toward the group of passengers clustered near the airline desk. Their eyes darted toward him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Some had their phones out, the small devices aimed in his direction. He sighed inwardly. It wasn't the first time he'd been the center of unwanted attention, but this felt different. A man, middle-aged and well-dressed, stepped forward and approached Marcus. "Excuse me, Colonel," he said, his voice measured but concerned. "Are you all right? We saw what happened back there with security. It didn't look right." "I'm fine," Marcus replied, his tone calm but distant. He didn't want to linger on the humiliation he'd just endured. "You don't look fine," the man pressed, frowning. "They treated you like you didn't belong, and that's not right. Not for someone like you." Before Marcus could respond, another voice called out from the growing crowd. "I got it on video," a younger man said, holding up his phone. "The way they searched you was completely unnecessary." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and more passengers began to gather, their voices rising in indignation. "If they can do that to a colonel, what does that say about the rest of us?" someone muttered, their tone sharp with frustration. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This was spiraling into something he couldn't control, and he wasn't sure he wanted it to. He had a mission to focus on, a solemn promise to fulfill, and the last thing he needed was to be thrust into the center of a public controversy. "Look," Marcus said, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of calm. "I appreciate the concern, but there's no need to make this into more than it is." But his words did little to quell the growing tide of voices. Passengers began recording, their phones capturing every detail of his calm demeanor, the uniform that marked his service, and the lingering tension in the air. By the time Marcus returned to his seat, the energy around him had shifted further. News of the incident was spreading online, fueled by hashtags and videos shared across social media. Clips of Marcus being led away by security, his medals gleaming against his uniform, were already circulating. Each retweet carried outrage. "Respect our heroes." Some captions read. Others demanded accountability for what was being called blatant discrimination. The whispers around the gate turned to open discussion. "I can't believe they treated him like that," a woman said, her voice laced with anger. "A colonel, for God's sake." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring straight ahead as his phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the notifications, messages from strangers, fellow soldiers, and even journalists flooded his screen. Everyone wanted a comment, a reaction, or an acknowledgement of the injustice they'd witnessed. "Colonel Reed," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a young woman with a microphone in hand and a cameraman trailing behind her. "We're with Channel 5 News. Can we get a statement about what happened earlier? The public deserves to know." Marcus straightened his posture, his expression unreadable. "I have no comment," he said firmly, his voice low and controlled. "But, Colonel," the reporter persisted, "how do you feel about being treated this way while on a mission to honor a fallen soldier? Don't you think this speaks to larger issues of discrimination in our society?" Marcus inhaled deeply, willing himself to remain calm. He had no interest in being a symbol or a headline. "I'm just here to bring my friend home," he said finally, his voice steady. "That's all that matters." The reporter hesitated, clearly dissatisfied with his answer. But Marcus turned his attention back to the flashing departure board, signaling that the conversation was over. As the day wore on, the situation outside the terminal escalated. News of Marcus's ordeal had sparked protests, with crowds gathering outside the airport. People held signs that read "Honor all soldiers and justice for Colonel Reed." Their chants echoed through the walls of the terminal, a mix of frustration and solidarity. Inside, airline staff grew visibly uneasy. Executives convened emergency meetings, and security officers avoided eye contact as they patrolled the gates. The mounting pressure was palpable, and Marcus could feel it in the way employees scurried past him, their expressions tight with worry. Marcus, however, remained still. His resolve was unshaken, his focus unbroken. The noise around him, the protests, the cameras, the viral posts, was secondary to the promise he had made to Keller. Every delay, every indignity, every unnecessary obstacle was another step in a journey he was determined to complete. He pulled Keller's dog tag from his pocket, running his thumb over the engraving. The memory of their last conversation on the battlefield played in his mind once more, a reminder of the brotherhood they had shared. "We're almost there," Marcus whispered, his voice low but firm. "I won't let them stop me. Keller, I'll get you home." As the tension within the airport escalated, Marcus sat in quiet contemplation. Every injustice he had endured that day weighed heavily on his shoulders. But his resolve remained unyielding. He was not one to back down, not when it came to honoring the promise he had made. Yet, amidst the chaos, allies began to emerge, unexpected and steadfast. It started with a call. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, General Adams. Marcus straightened, his military discipline kicking in, and answered. "Colonel Reed." The deep, commanding voice greeted him. "I heard about the situation at the airport." "General," Marcus replied, his tone formal but tinged with frustration. "It's been challenging. Challenging doesn't begin to cover it," Adams said, a sharp edge in his voice. "I've already started making calls. This isn't just going to blow over. Marcus, we're taking action." The words brought a small measure of relief to Marcus, though he knew the battle was far from over. "Thank you, sir," he said simply, his gratitude genuine. Minutes after the call ended, a new figure entered the terminal. Lieutenant Colonel Foster, a retired officer with a commanding presence, approached Marcus with purposeful strides. Foster had been a mentor during Marcus's early years of service, a man whose respect was hard-earned and whose loyalty was unwavering. "Marcus," Foster said, clapping him on the shoulder, "heard that we're giving you trouble." "It's been a day," Marcus replied, a faint smile breaking through his stoic demeanor. Foster's sharp eyes scanned the area, taking in the nervous airline staff and the growing crowd of protesters outside. His expression hardened. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "A decorated officer on an honorable mission. And they treat you like this?" "They did," Marcus confirmed, his voice calm. "But it's not about me. It's about Keller." Foster shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "No, Marcus, it's about all of us. This isn't just a bad day. It's a symptom of something bigger. And I'm not letting them get away with it." He pulled out his phone and began dialing, his voice firm as he rallied other veterans and military leaders to apply pressure on the airline and airport management. Meanwhile, the situation outside the terminal continued to grow. The protest had swelled in size, with more voices joining the chant, "Respect our soldiers." News outlets picked up the story, and footage of Marcus's mistreatment spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags like #Justice for Colonel Reed and #Respect Our Heroes trended nationally, drawing widespread condemnation of the airport's actions. Inside the terminal, Marcus noticed a shift in the staff's behavior. Airline representatives approached him hesitantly, their nervousness palpable. "Colonel Reed," one of them began, their tone apologetic. "We deeply regret the inconvenience and would like to offer you an upgrade and access to our VIP lounge." Marcus met the man's gaze, his expression unwavering. "I don't need an upgrade," he said firmly. "I need my flight and the casket to depart on time." The representative nodded, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's refusal. "Of course, sir. We're doing everything we can to expedite the process." It wasn't long before a new figure entered the terminal, a senior executive from the airline's corporate office. His face was pale, his steps hesitant as he approached Marcus. "Colonel Reed," the man began, his voice carefully measured, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you've endured. This is not how we conduct business, and we deeply regret any offense caused." Marcus's gaze remained steady, his silence a powerful statement. The executive fumbled for words, finally adding, "We've arranged for the flight to be prioritized, and the casket will be handled with the utmost care. All I want," Marcus said, his voice low but firm, "is to get my friend home. That's it." The executive nodded quickly, relieved that Marcus wasn't escalating the confrontation. "Understood, sir. We'll ensure everything goes smoothly from here." As the airline staff scrambled to make amends, Marcus found himself joined by another ally, a veteran from Keller's hometown, a man Marcus had never met. Approach him with a firm handshake and a knowing look. "You're not alone in this, Colonel," he said. "We're all behind you." Marcus nodded, his gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. The man's words echoed in his mind as he prepared to board the flight. Despite the obstacles, despite the injustice, Marcus knew he was not fighting this battle alone. As the protest chants outside grew louder, Marcus stood at the gate, Keller's dog tag in his hand. He whispered softly, "We're almost there, brother. Just a little longer." With that, he stepped onto the plane, one step closer to fulfilling his promise and carrying his brother home. The flight touched down in Keller's hometown, just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Marcus stared out the small plane window, his reflection merging with the distant horizon. The exhaustion that gripped him was profound, but his determination to fulfill his promise burned brighter than ever. As the aircraft came to a halt, Marcus rose from his seat, his military posture as precise as it had been in the terminal. Airline staff, now deferential, guided him to the tarmac where Keller's casket, draped in the American flag, was carefully unloaded. Marcus stepped forward, his fingers brushing over the flag, smoothing every fold. His voice, soft but resolute, broke the morning silence. "We're here, brother. We made it." The journey was far from over, but Marcus allowed himself a fleeting moment of peace as he escorted the casket to a waiting military transport. The vehicle, a solemn symbol of the final leg of this mission, carried them through the quiet streets of Keller's hometown. Flags lined the route, placed there by residents who had heard of Marcus's journey and wanted to honor the fallen soldier. At the gates of the small cemetery, Keller's family waited. His mother clutched a worn photograph of her son, her tear-streaked face etched with both grief and gratitude. Keller's father, his silver hair glinting in the early morning light, approached Marcus with a firm handshake. "Colonel Reed," he said, his voice trembling, "thank you for bringing him home." Marcus returned the handshake, his grip steady. "It was my honor, sir," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Keller was my brother in every way that mattered." Mrs. Keller stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for Marcus's arm. "He always spoke so highly of you," she whispered. "He said if anything ever happened to him, you'd bring him back. You kept your promise." Marcus swallowed hard, the knot in his throat almost unbearable. "I promised him, ma'am, and I don't break promises." The family nodded, their gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. They gestured toward the procession, waiting to lead Keller to his final resting place. Soldiers in crisp dress uniforms flanked the path, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Local residents, many holding small flags, stood in quiet reverence as the casket was carried through the cemetery. The mournful notes of taps filled the air, played by a lone bugler. The haunting melody echoed through the trees. A final farewell to a soldier who had given his all. Marcus stood at attention beside the casket, his hand raised in a crisp salute. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture a testament to the respect and love he held for his fallen comrade. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Marcus remained still, the weight of his promise pressing down on him. He had done what he had set out to do, but the reality of letting go was a new battle altogether. The ceremony drew to a close, but Marcus had one more thing to say. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Thomas Keller was more than a soldier. He was a friend, a brother, and a man of honor. He saved my life more times than I can count. And when he fell, I swore I'd bring him home. Today, I keep that promise." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. Keller didn't care about the color of my skin or the stripes on my uniform. He cared about the man standing beside him. That's the way it should always be. The crowd stood in silence, the weight of his words settling over them like a shared burden. Marcus lowered his hand from the salute and stepped back, allowing Keller's family to place flowers on the casket. As they knelt beside the grave, their quiet tears spoke of the love they had for their son and the gratitude they felt toward the man who had brought him home. After the ceremony, Marcus lingered at the gravesite, his thoughts heavy with memories of Keller. The bond they had shared was one forged in the crucible of war, unbreakable even in death. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Keller's dog tag, running his thumb over the engraved name. He whispered, "I'll see you on the other side, brother." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the crowd began to disperse. Several townspeople approached Marcus to express their gratitude, their voices laced with admiration and sorrow. "We won't forget what you've done," one man said. "You've honored him in a way no one else could." Later that evening, Marcus joined Keller's family for a small gathering at their home. It was a quiet affair, filled with laughter and tears as they reminisced about Keller's life. His mother pulled Marcus aside, pressing a folded letter into his hand. "Tom wrote this for you before he left," she said softly. "He wanted you to have it, in case." Marcus unfolded the letter, the familiar handwriting stirring memories of their time together. It was short but powerful. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you kept your promise. Thank you for getting me home. Brother, I'll see you on the other side." The words hit Marcus harder than any battlefield wound. He folded the letter carefully, placing it alongside Keller's dog tag. That night, as he raised a glass in Keller's memory, Marcus knew that despite the obstacles and injustices he had faced, he had done what he set out to do. He had carried his brother home. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Marcus stood by the window of the small guest room where he had stayed. In his hand was Keller's dog tag, a tangible reminder of the journey they had shared. The fight for justice, for respect, was far from over. But for now, Marcus had fulfilled his promise. And in doing so, he had found a measure of peace. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Colonel Marcus Reed, a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of promises kept. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more incredible tales that inspire and connect us. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.